And thanks so much for allowing us to have this launch with you guys. I've been following some of the sessions into the night last night and enjoyed some of them very much. Learned a lot and so on. So I think there's a lot of scope for collaboration. Our current work in this group here in Sydney is actually now on renewables and legitimacy, social legitimacy for renewables across these three countries. But this project we're talking about tonight, which is culminated in this book, so this is the first outing for this book, began back in 2014 and took us on quite a journey, which we'll go through today. There's a few of us, but we've prepared one PowerPoint, which hopefully will move things along, and we're aiming to manage to finish this sort of in about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then have enough time for some chat and so on. So I'll jump in just with a brief introduction, and then we'll go through each of the cases. It's ethnographic work based in India, Australia, and Germany, and we're going to have the people who were involved in the ethnographies speaking for 10 minutes each, and then I'll wrap up at the end with a bit of comparative lessons really from this project. So I'll do the screen. Am I sharing the screen now?
You should be allowed to share,
okay,
but we don't see that yet.
Let me have a go. Fantastic, great. So this is our opening gambit. Is essentially on first off, the centrality of coal. And as many of us are, of course, concerned about climate change, we're very aware of the importance of coal for climate change, but also it's very important to be aware of the importance of coal for the kind of society that has emerged from industrial capitalism and industrial developmentalism. And the importance of coal for that, including in high-income countries, and of course in coal-dependent localities, as we'll come to in a minute. It's a centrality of coal at the same time for emissions and climate change. In any strategy for stable climate requires a phase out of coal, as I'll come to in a minute. And this creates what Jairam Ramesh, who's former environment minister, who one of us, Tom, interviewed, called the cruel coal conundrum. This conundrum that on the one hand, coal in his view is necessary for prosperity and industrial development and so on, but on the other hand is the central cause of climate change. So we have this conundrum, of course, coal versus climate, and just briefly, 1/3 of course, global emissions come from coal-fired electricity. Yet at this very moment, the world was embarking on the Kyoto Protocol and so on. There was a massive coal rush, almost a doubling of coal output in the space of a decade, ensuring that coal became the main driver of climate change. And in fact, as the IPCC put it, this is quite a remarkable quote, the increased use of coal reversed the long-standing trend of gradual decarbonisation. So, sorry, I jumped back there. There's a centrality now, of course, of overcoming coal dependence is now a consensus position. The Beyond Coal Rush project that we initiated back in 2014, I was asking, of course, how can coal be halted and reversed? And we focused on these three countries because of they're enmeshed in very different forms of developmentalism, post-colonial, extractivist, high-tech, post-industrial. And we're trying to learn lessons across these contexts for halting, reversing coal. And in order to do that, we focused on proposed mines in the three contexts, 3 proposed mines or mine extensions. And and we were interested in finding out how people were opposing these mines, and were they what they were doing to try to delay them or stop them. And this was a 3-year process, attending events and so on. Focus on this idea of the narratives of coal, on the kinds of narratives and scripts that people were producing to oppose coal, but also for the advocates for these mines, what kind of narratives were they producing in the context of climate change that their proposed mine should go ahead. It produced some media as we went along, but also at the end, as we'll hear, a 3-hour document, three 1-hour documentaries in a series, an energy policy specialist, you are now this book. So we've been, we've been quite busy with it. So I'll step back now, and we'll talk about the cases each in turn, and then we'll come back to some comparative lessons. And the first one is Chhattisgarh, and I'm going to introduce Devleena Ghosh, who's my long-term colleague here at UCS, who's in the room here, and Kanchi from Delhi, who's worked with us for on this project and for many years to discuss the India case. Now this seems to be jumping a bit. We can make it move by pressing that button there. Or maybe actually that button there is better. It seems to doesn't work there. That button there. Yeah. So I'll just get you in the picture so people can see you. There we are.
Hi everyone. So I'll try and be concise if possible, because of course the India case is an extremely complex case, as are the others. But the population and the size and diversity of India makes any statement of homogeneity much more complicated. So this is the area in which I worked. You can see the map of India, and that area in red is Chhattisgarh, and then you can see at the top there is of Chhattisgarh, there's a district called Sarguja, and that is really where we carried out most of our work. So when we arrived in the field, one of the things that we were going to look at was to try and see how coal mining and climate change were linked, and how the people in the area reacted to climate change, and whether that in their minds the mining of coal and the burning of coal was connected to climate change. What we ended up finding was that in fact climate change was a very small part of their concerns. Their main concern was the loss of land and livelihood to the coal mines. And also what was interesting was to see in a post-colonial state how their attempts to resist the juggernaut of corporate resource extraction was dependent upon the various ways in which they took strength from the Indian Constitution, and also from certain instruments that had been brought in by the previous government. Now, the thing is that there are two sets of competing discourses here in India. Well, not just two, but let's say in this particular sort of context. It is for the government of India generally, and not just the current one, but the ones previously as well, the mining and industrialization in general has been very much about trying to redress India's development imperative. You know, there are huge numbers of statistics about malnourishment in India. There are statistics about over 400, almost close to 450 million people have no electricity. You know, the Gini per capita is 1/10 of the OECD average, and the high rates of economic growth before the last couple of years and before COVID have not led to corresponding reductions in poverty. And in fact, Greenpeace actually wrote a report which said that even though the government was talking up coal mining and power production as a way of pulling people out of poverty, that most of the benefits of coal mining and most of the power production was actually going into urban areas and to sort of more elite people. So given this fact, the government in hand with corporations, mining corporations, are very much pro-mining and have actively pushed for coal mining in a variety of areas. the area that we were looking at was one of the, I suppose you would say the most dense contiguous forests, a place called Hasdioran Forest. It has waterways, it has animals like elephants and tigers. It has one of the highest scheduled tribe, or Adivasi, which is basically considered to be the indigenous people of India. Almost 10% of the indigenous people of India live here. 41.33% of the state is forested, and it contains resources essential to Adivasi livelihood. And the mineral resources are very high in that, especially for coal reserves. And I think there's sort of certain figures, but when we were looking at it, it was about 18% of total national coal production. And so the forests themselves have, as I said, water sources, rare plants, wildlife species, and including elephants and leopards. And it also has over 1 billion metric tons of proven coal reserves across almost 1,900 square kilometers of area. So the Adivasis, or the people, the forest-dwelling indigenous people who live in the area, have had a history of being at the receiving end of various discourses of growth. So British colonial government intervention in forest land in the 19th century was basically took over the forest via the various acts, but the 1878 Act, which was closed off major parts of the forest in this area for indigenous users. And this was mainly done by the demand for development, in this particular case for railways and railway sleepers. And because railway sleepers took one, tall sal tree each and had to be replaced quite rapidly, it meant that there was an enormous deforestation in this period, and the indigenous people were generally, pushed out of the area, even though they resisted and they protested very much. The other thing about the British was that it was that they really saw the Adivasis, or the indigenous people, as not being, in a sense, part of their vision of a nation. They had a very Lockean idea of land and of property. So because they saw the Adivasis as not actually developing the land or improving it, because Adivasi people more or less inhabited the land, they often didn't actually try to clear it or to farm it or to build things on it or to improve it. They saw them as actually being quite peripheral to the land. And part of that is also, I think, was quite interesting to us to look at how these kinds of colonial archives circulate, because the two acts I'm going to talk about very briefly, the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act and the Forest Rights Act, were very much based upon Australian laws regarding native title rights. And we were told this by Jairam Ramesh, who James just mentioned. So these two acts, the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act and the Forest Rights Act, were brought in by the previous government, and they were brought in to bring the scheduled areas, which is the areas which the British had scheduled as being outside their sort of developmental sort of ideas, that these areas were to be brought into the nation, so that they would be governed by village assemblies, and land and these village assemblies or gram sabhas had to consent before any land in scheduled areas could be acquired by non-Adivasis and for developmental projects. And the Forest Rights Act, about 10 years after, recognized the historic injustice to forest-dwelling people and gave them a variety of rights, and including individual rights to forested land as well as community rights. Now, the Adivasis of India, through the Schedules 5 and 6, have actually been recognized in the Constitution as people who have particular claim to the government's intervention on their part because of these historic injustices. And they've had some victories. For example, in 2013, the Supreme Court of India, in a landmark judgment, ruled that the Gram Sabhas, village councils of 12 villages in the Niyamgiri area, they would have to give their consent before their land could be mined for bauxite. And in the Hastewaran area where we had done our work, various villages also united against the government plans to mine and passed a formal resolution against coal mining. So what we found here was kind of a contention between the notions of development and the notions of Adivasi life. That is, what the Adivasis presented it as Vikash nahi, Vinash hai, which is literally means this is not development, it is destruction. So what was seen as development by the state was seen as destruction of their particular ways of life. And even though initially some sort of villagers in this area were attracted by various rewards that were promised by the mines, it soon became clear that most of the mines that came afterwards were going to destroy their habitat, and the people that we met by and large had now become quite very much opposed to the mines. So and basically what we also saw, that there was a variety of non-compliance with the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act and the Forest Rights Act, in that very often the Gram Sabhas were not informed about acquisitions, or consent orders were forged, or there was one particular case where a village had actually I think on a number of occasions refused to let their land be mined, and so at the state government level, that village was turned into a town, which made it go, which actually put it outside the PESA Act. And also there will be a number of violations of the FRA. Community collective applications have been refused. Less than, I think, I can't remember the figure, I think Kanchi may remember, but less than, I think, 50% of FRA applications under the FRA have actually been successful, and people have got much less land than they've actually applied for. There's been pollution of the water, of the water table, of the air, animals. I mean, because the Adivasis have grazing animals that they were able to send off into the forest in general. Now they can't do that because the water is not fit to drink. There's been a variety of displacements and people and villages which have been displaced more than once. And also for the Adivasis, their paddy fields and their resources from the forests have also been impacted by the mining. So basically, what we saw was that there was a large number of protests and legal remedies sought through the courts. And these protests and legal remedies were sometimes successful and very often not. Sometimes all they did was actually delay the implementation of the mines. And in some ways, we were told by a lawyer that it may in fact be that the Adivasis were better off under the British, because according to the 2011 Bill about land acquisition, land can be acquired for public purpose even without even by private companies, so that it can be acquired for almost any project. Because public interest is undefined. So so this has been the case, and what we ended up as seeing is really that we have a situation where Adivasis are now sort of are now in a state of asking for their rights as citizens, but within a state which is which is opposing these rights on the basis of development, but very often in a situation which is very much focused on the profits of private companies and big corporations. So that's really where we end up.
Thanks, Davina. We might move on. So Kanchi, I think, will join in the discussion later on. We might move on to the, so there's some images here that Davina didn't go through. This is pictures of villages and,
Oh, sorry.
yeah, that's right. There's a particularly important one here, Davina.
Yes.
From Adani coal company. We have only one Earth, let's save it. Tells you something about the power of rhetoric, I guess. And then we'll get on to the Australia case with Linda. So Linda, I think I can click through from here if you want to come on.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, James, and thanks, Devlina. We've taken a sort of compare and contrast approach with these case studies, and you'll see that there are some similarities with the Indian case study, interestingly, as well as some differences. My work was undertaken with a couple of other members of the team, Tom Morton and Rebecca Pearce, in the Liverpool Plains in New South Wales in southeastern Australia. I don't know whether you've got your pointer there and you can actually point to that little box on the map of Australia first, just the map of Australia there, the little black box, James, to show where the Liverpool Plains is located. Yeah, so it's on the most populous southeast coastal area and hinterland of Australia, which is where also most of the most valuable coal reserves are located. And at a certain point, as our study referred to the coal rush and James referred to the time frame from the early 2000s through to about 2012, at a certain point, the New South Wales government, got the glint of massive coal royalties and other boons in its eyes and decided to open up an area of very productive agricultural land that had never really been opened up to farming before, very well-watered, rich black soil plains called the Liverpool Plains, just over the Great Dividing Range from the Hunter Valley, which is a very heavily coal-mined area of New South Wales going back to the 19th century. So there were, much to the shock of local people, including some, very wealthy and affluent broadacre farmers in this part of New South Wales with very large properties, some of them over 1 million hectares in extent, very large turnovers. And also the Gomeroi people, one of the Indigenous Australian groups, the Aboriginal groups that are one of the largest people and the largest area of land in traditional lands in New South Wales. Was a real shock in around 2005, 2006, when suddenly mining leases were opened up in this, valuable land from the point of view of these two particular local groups, but also many other people in this region. And two big multinational and state-owned company, BHP Billiton and Watermark, which is a Chinese government-owned company, opened up mining exploration leases with the full encouragement of the New South Wales government at that time. So you can just see there the two hatched areas. Can you just point those out, James, on the map? And they're in a very well-watered area. This, of course, was a time of severe drought, and it developed, up until really last year. There's been a quite severe drought in this period of New South Wales and the rest of the country. And so this was part of the concerns that informed the opposition to these coal mines by the farmers in particular, because of the necessity of both irrigated water and the groundwater of the Mukai River for their farming productivity. Could you do the next slide, please, James?
Yeah, hopefully.
So the basis of the opponent's stances, as James has already mentioned, we identified two key groups. As I mentioned, the farmers and the Gomeroi Aboriginal traditional owners of this land. And they, as Devlina outlined for India, and this is one of the similarities, were very strongly opposing the development of these coal mines, but they did not see themselves in either case as being against coal. In fact, very often the most common people, particularly the farmers, would say is, we're not really against coal, we just don't want this coal mine in this place. So what they saw was a very place-based threat to their livelihoods, and particularly the way they used their land, and also, of course, the critical loss of water, which is such a scarce resource in Australia, and then also their way of life. So their slogan was wrong mine, wrong place, and that appeared on many websites and rallies and banners and all sorts of things over many years. Indeed, is still around in the Liverpool Plains to this day. The Gomeroi Aboriginal traditional owners were really concerned about the loss of ancestral land and heritage. This is their ancestral country. It's something that can't be moved. It's unique and it's irreplaceable. And there was much talk about, you know, various heritage sites in this area that the company said, well, if we find anything valuable, we can just move it, which for Aboriginal people is simply completely against the grain of their thinking about their connection to country and their connection to their ancestors and the creative forces that made the country that they lived in for many generations, probably something like 30,000 years in this part of New South Wales. So the sorts of comments they would make, and this was particularly one they said about some very large grinding stones, you know, areas of huge sandstone embedded in the ground that were probably as big as, you know, somebody's living room, that the company actually proposed to move to get it out of the way because they had to make sure they protected in some way these sorts of ancestral heritage items. Gomeroi people would say typically things like, once you take it out of the ground where they are and shift it somewhere else, it's already destroyed. They simply couldn't see that there could be a separation of the, you know, the items and the land that they held dear, and the sort of maintenance of their own connection to the land. Of course, the coal mine being huge, both of the coal mines that were proposed, the BHP mine and the Shenhua mine, were very large mines, over 30 million, or over 30 megatons per year to be extracted from both of these mines. So they were making very big dents or voids in the countryside and penetrating very deeply to the point where underground water supplies, some precious aquifers, would be affected in this landscape. Can you do the next slide, please, James? So just to give you a visual image, this was a quite significant protest quite early in the time when people began to get very activated to protest this mine as the company got its development approval and started, you know, actually talking about construction. Gomeroi people did something that was quite unusual for them in that time, which was have a big protest on the main street. And they brought in, you know, various people that were allied with them in their struggle. And this is one of the interesting things that we found in these struggles, that people often form what we call unlikely alliances. So the Gomeroi formed alliances actually with local farmers who were people, of course, who had dispossessed them of their land in former generations, and also with anti-coal activists. So people used to join together in these sorts of demonstrations and rallies and various movements that took place to try and protest and stop the mines going ahead. And this was a particularly striking rally that took place in the main street of Gunnedah, the country town that was at the heart, the local government area at the heart of the development. And the Shenhua office actually had their office premises, the Chinese company had their office premises in this town. So there was quite a lot of activation in the town around this matter. And this was just one of the ways that people protested. And as you can see from some of the banners, it was really a high human rights issue for these people. They did feel they were being violated, and their fundamental rights as Indigenous people in Australia were being violated by this massive destruction of their landscape. The next slide, please, James. And on the other side of things, you know, we can see that the company, which, you know, both companies, of course, were very highly capitalized examples of coal capital, moving into a region of capitalized businesses. We'd have to say that these wealthy farmers are mostly family-owned agribusiness corporations. So in many ways, they had quite a lot of similarities with coal capital in the sense of being capitalist enterprises, you know, working in various ways to achieve accumulation in this setting. But of course, they had forms of capital that were directly opposed, or at least that's what the farmers claimed. So this is just a picture to show you the scale of the landscape here. Some of the fields that were being farmed. This is a sorghum field, which would have been producing sorghum for the Chinese whiskey market at that time. But they can be hundreds of hectares in extent. And I just put in there a picture with a coal train going across the middle, because there was already small coal mines in this region further up in less fertile land. And this train would be taking coal down to Newcastle in the Hunter Valley, which is still the world's largest exporting port of black coal, and was at that time. So that gives you some idea of the scale of operations in this place. Next slide, please, James.
We probably should move on to the next case in a minute, so yeah.
Yeah, sure. So this is, I think, my final slide. And I guess, you know, our question we asked ourselves was, how are these local people, these local groups, moving to try and destabilise the Liverpool Plains coal commodity? And we identified three ways in which they fought coal. One was, you know, this idea of communicating the value of place to decision makers and the public. So a lot of their rallies and protests had an eye on a public audience, the mass media and so on. This is unique to us. This is irreplaceable. It cannot be commodified. It cannot be replaced or displaced. One of their strategies for doing that was what we call situational alliances and actions, where they actually formed alliances, as I've already mentioned, with groups that they probably wouldn't form alliances with normally, but in this context of an emergency, they formed alliances with the Greens Party. The farmers and the Greens are actually not on very good terms in a lot of Australia, but this was a situation where they formed alliances. Also, activist groups, environmentalists, Gomeroi farmers, all managed to mobilise together in many different contexts. And the third thing was, and this was a feature of the Indian case that Devlina's outlined, was legislative challenges and re-regulating coal, and try to approach the state as the mediator between society and capital, and the state's obligation, in a sense, to hear its citizens and to hear their concerns, and trying to get a better deal in the legislative and regulatory framework for coal. For against coal and for the interests of the Gomeroi and the farmers. So, you know, just to sum up, I think, where did they end up in the outcomes? There's been some significant wins. BHP actually handed back the Karuna exploration licence, and there's been some increased regulatory requirements that particularly the farmers have managed to achieve as a result of that. There's been what I call some Pyrrhic victories. The New South Wales government, as a sort of a sop to the protesters, reduced the Shenhua licence area, but didn't really make much difference to the eventual operation of the mine. There's been lots of delays, and the Shenhua mine, I should say, is still ongoing. It has not been cancelled. It hasn't been built, but it hasn't been withdrawn either. So there's been over 10 years of opposition now. There's uncertainty and limbo for a lot of the local residents. A lot of agricultural investment has been stymied. There's been threats to water and heritage. They still remain. The game plan of the company, this Chinese company, and the government is not very clear. And it just seems as if at the moment we've been in this protracted stalemate now ever since we finished our research some years ago between big capital, the agribusinesses, and bigger capital, coal, and the federal and state government agencies that regulate and legislate, and of course the Chinese government, which is very important in the Australian version of geopolitics. I'll leave it there. Thanks, James.
Thanks very much, Linda. We'll now hand over to Tom and Katja. I'm not sure how
I'm going to do it first.
Katja can just join in if she
Okay, well,
want to. So go ahead.
and have I got control of the slides here,
With
James?
this here, you can do that.
Great, fantastic. All right, thanks, James. Hi, everyone. I'm Tom Morton, and I'm going to be talking together with my colleague Katja Müller from the Martin Luther University in Halle about our fieldwork in Germany. Katja's background is an anthropologist, I'm a journalist. We did the work together there over a period of about 3 years, and I'm going to talk for about 5 minutes about the case study itself and why we chose it, and then Katja is going to talk a bit about the different forms of opposition and protest that emerged in our case study. And one thing I'd say just at the start is whilst there are many differences between the case studies, one thing that they all had in common when we started was the fact that they were all at different stages and with different kinds of economic and social and political backgrounds. All three countries were part of what we at the time perceived as a global coal rush. As James said at the start, it appeared in 2014 when we started this research that there was something like a global coal rush happening precisely at the time when, of course, the IPCC and many other bodies were saying that we needed to cut coal consumption dramatically. So, the German case study. We're looking here at a view over a village called Atterwasch. Atterwasch is in the east of Germany, very close to the border with Poland. It's a small village. The church in the village dates back to about 1220. Many of the residents in the village can trace their ancestry back to the time of the 30 Years' War. And as you can see, it's both a place that is very old, but also is characterized by a particular kind of what you might call bucolic post-industrial modernity, because over the next hill, as you can see, there is a wind farm. So why did we choose to do our case study in Atterwasch and two neighbouring villages, Kerkwitz and Grabko? Well, because of this. That is the Jenschwalde power plant, which is only a few kilometres away from Atterwasch, Kerkwitz and Grabko. The Jenschwalde power plant is the largest brown coal-fired power plant in the whole of Germany. It consumes about 80,000 tonnes of lignite or brown coal every day, or did at the time. It's the fifth most heavily emitting power plant, coal-fired power plant in the whole of Europe. And as you can see, it's part of the same landscape that we saw beforehand. So on the one hand, we've got this very rural setting, agriculture going on in the fields, people living in villages that have been around for a long, long time. On the other hand, this is a real centre of coal-fired power in Germany. And in 2007, about 7 years before we started the case study, the company that owned the coal-fired power plant and also the coal mines, adjacent coal mines at the time, Vattenfall, a Swedish state-owned company, announced that they wanted to mine an extra 200 million tonnes of brown coal over the next 20 years. That's a view over the nearby coal mine. So you can see it's the coal-fired power plant in the background and the coal mine which feeds it in the foreground. So basically what Vattenfall wanted to do was to expand the coal mine, and in order to do that, they would have had to demolish Atavash, that village we saw at the start, and the 2 other villages. So immediately there was a conflict between the continuing livelihoods, the continuing existence of the homes of local people and the coal industry, which said at the time that it needed to expand production in order to go on running the coal-fired power plants past the middle of the 2020s. So why was this important? Well, for a couple of reasons. One of them was that Vattenfall was saying that it needed to ramp up coal production in Germany, or coal production at its Jensfelder mine, precisely at the time that Germany, the German federal government, was saying that it needed to accelerate the pace of Germany's energy transition and move more rapidly towards decarbonisation. Germany in 2011, just after the Fukushima nuclear disaster, had committed to an exit from nuclear power by 2022 and had also committed in the same package of legislation to full decarbonisation of the German economy by 2050. So there appeared to be a real paradox, a conundrum, as James said at the start here. On the one hand, Germany ramping up the energy transition, driving faster towards a greater participation for renewable energy in the economy. On the other hand, companies like Vattenfall saying that in order to make up the gap, if you like, in energy production, electricity production, that would be that would happen after 2020 with the end of nuclear power in Germany, that they needed to increase the production of coal as what they called a transitional fuel. I'm sure we've heard that phrase before. So we had this kind of paradox that, as I said, Vattenfall wanted to increase coal production here at the Jensfelder coal mine, and at the same time, Germany as a whole was saying, or the German government as a whole was saying, actually, we need to slow down coal production. At the time that we started our field work, renewables contributed about 28.5% of electricity in Germany, and coal was still generating 42% of electricity. So the residents of these villages decided to try and prevent the destruction of their villages, their fields and forests. And in order to do that, they began protesting and they also began forming alliances with environmental groups and in particular climate activist groups in Germany. And Katja is now going to talk a bit about those alliances and why they were so important for our analysis of the case.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Tom. Can you just show us the next slide? Because I'm going to take you to the ground, sort of thinking about trying to get you involved into the thinking of local people who are all of a sudden confronted through a letter found in their mailbox with the potential devastation of their villages. And other than in Australia, where we have these large-scale farmers which have at least some influence or alliances with parties, the people in the Lausitz, these people in the villages, which are altogether about 900 people, did not have a strong stand within local or even national politics. So finding this letter in your mailbox in 2007 was a starting point for them to form alliances on a very, very local level. So what they did was they formed so-called citizen initiatives. And they thought about how can we make our protest, our disagreement with the plans of Vattenfall and the Brandenburg government, the state government, being heard. So what they started was local protest marches. And here you see an image of one of these protest marches, which takes place every January, the so-called Sternmarsch. It draws people from the three named villages, from Atavash, Kerkwitz, and Grabko, as well as a few people from the surroundings who might also support their case. And in the beginning, this was really small-scale protest, which, well, frankly speaking, didn't draw much attention because it was already sort of common sense that in the last 150 years that brown coal is a major stake in this region, you pretty much can't do much against these devastations. So even though you might voice your protest, especially in GDR times, you had no say of, this is my land, I don't want to give it away, because it's national interest to provide energy for the country. Hence, even if you're the owner of the state, according to law, you might be devastated. Still kind of drawing on this notion of there is no way, but living in a different system, as the GDR is no longer the system prevailing, people took to small-scale protest forms. And next to the Sternmarch, which you can see here, they also had this regular meeting each October, where they had something like a village fete in front of the church, in front of the local church, drawing again a few people from the villages, as well as a few groups from further away, like small-scale NGOs, a publisher of the area, books related to the area, and the like. It was only a few years later, in 2014, when, as the next slide shows, they started to align also with environmental NGOs that have a national or even international outreach. So what you see here is a human chain that was formed across the river Neisse, which is the river forming the border between Germany and Poland, which draws actually not just a few people from the villages, usually about 100 people might attend these small-scale protests, but actually drew a couple of thousand people. And these, in this case, I think it was 3,000 people. They came together on the occasion of so-called climate camps, which is again another way of forming alliances with other people who, potential outsiders. So what we find here is new alliances, not unlike the ones in Australia, but not between large-scale farmers and Green Party members or Green activists, but between Green activists and local people who are usually small-scale farmers or people who are working in local industries. So this drew actually not just national attention, but in the further, advancing further also international attention when it became bigger in 2016. It drew media attention, and it actually was quite obvious that you had to form these alliances in order to get heard. So the kind of narrative that we traced out in the things that were happening on the ground is that in order to make a local interest heard or a local topic heard on a national level, where decisions are made, as Tom laid out, there are actually regulations within Germany as towards advancing the energy transition. In order to make these national bodies recognize your local interests, people took to international alliances to make their issues heard. And these were formed on the ground of climate change, on the ground of climate protection and environmental protection. So the next slide actually shows another instance of allying with people from the outside and the international attempt, because you can see Cold Kills, of course, is a slogan that was internationally formed or taken up. It's not German, it's English, and actually, well, of course, people speak German here. And this image also draws media attention. It is, drone pictures is nothing that people would locally, come up with as a media, media attention drawing staging of the protest, but this was formed by people from the villages as well as majorly orchestrated by Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, and other internationally active NGOs. And to make a long story short, actually it to some extent paid off to form these alliances, as the last slide shows. You might not be able to actually see what it is. That's why I'm taking you through this picture. It's a boulder that is situated in one of these three villages in Kerkwitz, and it says, "No one shall ever move it again." So pretty much this boulder symbolizing the fact that people fought for altogether 10 years. It will have the numbers written down there, 2007 and 2017. So it symbolizes that people fought for 10 years against this particular coal mine extension coming to their places and eventually winning this fight which is, to just put it frankly, which is not just due to economic arguments. This is, of course, what Vattenfall and their successors, EPH, put up front, but it's also due to the protests that local people, in cooperation with national and international NGOs, reached. So the protests on the street contributed to the fact that in 2017, the succeeding company EPH said they will not continue mining in this particular mine, and they took these 3 villages off the proposed coal mine maps. And with this, I'll hand back to James.
Okay, yeah. Thanks very much, Katja, Tom, and everyone. Surprisingly, this took us a little bit longer to talk through. So I'll just skip through some of the themes that emerge from this and some of the comparative lessons and so on. And then we'll hopefully have some time for discussion when we obviously can respond, but also Katja can come in. The themes, the crucial relationship between energy and developmentalist ideology, absolutely central, as exposed by all 3 of the cases, where Australia is a link between extractivism, obviously, and these mines going ahead, and as a developmentalist ideology in Australia. In India, the post-colonial development model, entailing, as Ramesh said, an industrial development model based on coal. And in Germany, the whole transition away from coal, reflecting a sort of a post-industrial development ideology. So very important to think about these questions in terms of developmentalism. In all cases, it's all about the state, and the state, of course, allows all this to go ahead, and it politicizes state institutions, departments, and so on that are captured by coal, and they become key sites for exposing the manipulation of those public institutions, but also for creating new avenues, new ways to institutionalize the transition. We've seen that in Germany with the commission set up for the phase out of coal, but also we've seen it in Australia, as Linda mentioned, around the question of water and coal, and in a variety of other contexts. So very important. Incommensurability is a central issue. The extent to which the companies are able to persuade people to accept coal is very much hinges on the extent to which it is seen as an incommensurable challenge to their livelihood, as I'll come to in a minute. And then finally, these questions of climate articulation, as I'll come to in a minute again, coal industrial complex, and these concepts of the relationship between energy and climate as a dialectic, that in a sense what is happening now, and certainly since we've done this study, when global coal is leveled off, the boom hasn't continued, but it hasn't declined, global production hasn't declined, but the extent to which there's an unraveling of this conundrum, of this nexus between prosperity and coal with the advent of renewables. So these kind of the concepts that have emerged for us. As we've discussed through this session, a key problem for us has been this articulation between coal and climate on the ground, the extent to which people were mobilizing against coal in the name of a stable climate. And of course, as we've heard, that was not always, or quite rarely actually, the case. But it became clear, and about a third of the book is based on this, where we analysed national level policy making, became clear that as national debate moves with climate policy, with recognition of the need to move beyond fossil fuels, that undermines the wider positive meaning of coal, defining it as a threat rather than an asset. And that then creates a context in which these anti-coal struggles can gain ground. So even if those opposing coal are not necessarily climate campaigners, in fact, some may be skeptics climate denialists. Even if that's the case, still their campaigns are more likely to win as coal and the meaning of coal becomes undermined, becomes seen as a threat. And also, as we've seen, that opens up new alliances and significance for these struggles. The dimensions that have come, this is the final section, in our conclusions from the book, several dimensions we've found were pretty critical. So first of all, what's going on before coal is proposed in these areas, the alternative development trajectory grounded in present day capacity. So we've heard about agro-industry, we've heard about Adivasi livelihood, critical in offering alternatives to this notion of the region has to sacrifice itself up to coal, and the mine has to sacrifice itself for the greater good, and people should accept compensation. This point about incommensurability, the extent to which those campaigners are able to mobilize intrinsic values, cultural, indigenous values, for instance, that sites have to remain in country. They can't be broken up and transported to a museum and somehow that's okay. That coal necessarily is in direct conflict with climate stability, ecological challenges that are incommensurable, and social challenges that villages once gone are gone forever. So this is very important, this idea, it's very important to immobilize an incommensurable challenge. So you can't be bought off by the company, you can't be offered sort of some coexistence, co-benefit arrangement. Thirdly, as we've seen, legitimacy, the state is absolutely central in capitalizing on fossil fuels and allowing this process to go ahead and facilitating it. These campaigns open up, expose, challenge those institutions. And so the campaigns themselves become campaigns for democracy, for democratizing the state, for overcoming the domination of fossil fuels over the state. Really important question of legitimacy then becomes, legitimacy then comes to the fore. And then two final points. Scale, we've heard, breaching the local, gaining allies and resonance beyond the locality on matters of the national economy, for instance, culture and ecology, as we've heard, as against what the corporates try to do, what the government tries to do, what the fossil fuel sector tries to do, is to keep the issue bounded into that locality. It can't be allowed to spill out and become a wider political question. And likewise with time, the companies and the governments are constantly seeking to limit the assessment of mines to an immediate cost-benefit nexus of how they define development, and that is very time limited and deliberately so, to prevent consideration of the longer term destructive impacts of fossil fuels into the future, of course, and also learning from its destructive impacts in these regions from the past. So these 5 dimensions, capacity and commensurability, legitimacy, scale and time, really came out very strongly from this project for us, and they're there right at the end of the book. And that's the book itself, Beyond the Coal Rush, which is coming out next month with Cambridge. And this is a few other things we did, a radio documentary that Tom did with ABC, which is a national broadcaster here, and also with a German broadcaster. There are 3 sections, all available online still, especially issue of energy policy and the book itself. And we've got a website, so you can have a look at those. I think we've finished with the presentation now, so we can have discussion.
Yes, and I wanted to, this is Sophia real quick, one of your EXALT organizers. I just wanted to offer, the room was supposed to close at 12:30, but we're in the lunch break right now. So for anybody that wants to stick around and have some discussion, we can offer you 15 more minutes, 10, 15 more minutes, okay? Thank you. So that means we have 15 minutes from now, is that right? Yes, that'll be fantastic. Perfect. That's really good. That's really good. So please feel welcome. Yeah. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Very interested. Can't wait to read the book. Okay. Who wants to ask a question?
And it'd be good to speak up actually, rather than put it into chat, just because it's easier. Barring that, in fact, while people perhaps are thinking about a question, maybe Kanchi, you would like to come in and talk about your impressions of the overall project, because you've been involved right from the start, from Delhi.
Kanchi, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, so thanks, James, for bringing me in. I think it actually was a very interesting project collectively to think about three very different kinds of coal geographies across the globe, and you know, both from looking at what kind of methodologies would work to understand these coal geographies, as well as see the dynamics that kind of you know, that constantly were throwing themselves at the researchers themselves. In fact, one of the most interesting things for me as part of this process was how much both the policies and the discourse around you know, around coal, around climate crisis was shifting, as much as what each of these areas and each of these case studies was shifting constantly. So I think, you know, because, I mean, we were doing this over 3.5 years, and over the last 1 year trying to put together the book. But from the time we put together the book to now, things have also, so many things, you know, dynamics have emerged in each of these places. So for instance, in Hasdeoran itself, you know, you had a shift of state government, you have a shift of, you know, Devina was talking about the focus on forest rights being, you know, non-existent in many of these areas. The shift of government has actually changed the dynamics in that sense. How much that actually affects, you know, how much that actually affects securing these areas or bringing in consent provisions at the forefront is yet to be seen. But what has also happened, I think, in many of these, and I can speak from the Indian context as well, is that you have, with the COVID crisis, with the economic slowdown in many countries, you also have coal really come back in a big way in the energy discourse. So, you know, I mean, we've just, in countries like India, you've just announced fresh coal auctions, including in the same area that we've done this project, you know. In fact, at that point of time, we were dealing with 1 or 2 mines that is likely to come up. Now it's 6 or 7, you know, ever since. So I think what has been fascinating about this project, and that's why in some ways, this book is it's an important, you know, it's an important, we managed to put together our thinking of a certain period, I think, of both the climate crisis as well as how coal is located in the energy policy context. But you know, you probably can have part 1, part 2, part 3 of the same discourse, because it's constantly shifting, and I'm sure it's shifting in many other countries as well. So, but I think the having a comparative lens across three different kinds of economies, 3 different kinds of contexts in which this is being spoken of, 3 different kinds of, you know, for instance, it's been very interesting because I remember discussing very clearly that climate change is not really a big thing when it comes to the Indian case study. More recently, if you see the last 6 or 8 months, Hasdeoran has figured very you know, front and central in all the Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, all those kinds of discourses. So that connections are coming up, you know, in a different way. So I think this is a very nice, you know, set of ideas that we brought together, which we'll probably, I don't know, we'll constantly be thinking about for a very long time, including in the next project that we thought of in terms of transitions. Yeah, that's all.
Thanks so much, Kanchi. Now, we're all gathering here around the screen. Barry's put his hand up. So, Barry, do you want to?
Yeah. Hi. Hello. Well, I learned a great deal from the presentations, and I'm grateful. And I think the book is truly an excellent piece of work. I have a question to ask you to reflect on. I mean, to what extent have you considered, or would you say that the findings that you had, those 5 concepts and principles in the conclusion that James summarized, which I think were quite insightful, that how well do they travel to other parts of the world or other situations, and including other sectors? Because in that sense, how do these cases contribute to further understandings of the global scale of what we are calling global extractivism? So I'd like to hear your thoughts about that. Thanks.
You guys want to say something?
I'll just be very brief. So our current project is about renewables, and I'm working on a big project in Karnataka on a big solar farm. And it was actually a relief to work on that project, because I thought it was kind of going to be more benign in some ways than the coal mining industry. But what's been interesting there is to also see the level of, or the ways in which people were not consulted, the ways in which the poorest peoples, the Dalits, indigenous people, found that their livelihoods were completely compromised, and the way in which people lost jobs, lost land, lost all kinds of things because of this solar park. And so, I mean, I think the important thing about all of this is that regardless of the aspect of climate change and the burning of fossil fuel, the mode of energy production, if it remains kind of profit driven, and it remains and it lacks consultation, proper consultation with the people on whose land these projects get carried out, you actually come across very similar kinds of problems. I mean, the solar energy takes a lot of land. So again, I mean, it's just been, that project has just started. Well, I mean, because of COVID, we haven't done as much work as we hoped to do, but very similar themes are emerging in that project as well.
Yeah, just a reflection on that. In the opening session of this whole symposium, we had Eduardo Godinez, Alexander Dunlap. Anyway, Alexander Dunlap has done work on precisely this kind of thing that you're talking about. And so in other words, that's a pattern which he studied in more than one site, particularly in Mexico, but other sites as well, including in Europe. In other words, just as you were saying, it's a similar dynamic, which has to do with very large scale, capitalized, industrial scale impositions on land and the local resistance that occurs for the reason that it's a dispossession and a destruction of their livelihood, very direct, right? So, I mean, if you haven't seen Alexander Dunlap's particular work on that and the violence of these infrastructures, you might want to have a look, or just go back and listen to our opening sessions, because they're all recorded. But it was a very good debate we had around that kind of situation.
Thanks so much. There's somebody else had their hand out, maybe a couple of people actually. So Patrick.
James, there's several people in the chat that have had their hands up for a while.
All right, okay. So can we go to Patrick first?
There's one before Patrick.
Is there? Okay.
Mirko?
Yeah, I might not have been the first one.
There's one before, if you look at the chat, James.
Sure. Okay, Mirko, please.
Is he muted, maybe?
I can't see. Is Mirko there?
He's muted, I think.
Maybe go to somebody else. Well, we heard Mirko a moment ago, but perhaps we can go to Patrick while we wait for.
Yeah, let's go to Patrick first, and then we'll go to Mirko. So please, yeah. Go.
Yeah, thanks a lot for a great set of presentations. I've been following this project in a way, seeing how you link up these really useful different perspectives of coal. One thing though, like my experience is mainly within domestic Indian coal, but increasingly I've also started tracing some of the links. I have a paper with co-authors on Mozambique and Indonesian coal coming to India. There's of course well-known links. Australian coal has for long been going to India, etc. So thinking around coal geographies and how they are formed and reformed, which is extremely frustrating and upsetting for many reasons, global climate change not the least. But I'm wondering, because in your presentations, it comes out a little bit as the local versus the national. But obviously that's not the whole picture. And we're trying to sort of untangle India's new imported coastal coal geography, where we're seeing there's local land relations and along the coast fishing communities, etc., much similar to what Kanchi has been writing about in her previous work also. But there's also a state level story. There's a national story. There's a transnational story of geopolitics coming in here. Is that sort of something that you would, want to reflect on in your sort of how these different scales and different stories might be able to reshape how coal is viewed nationally, federally, locally, or even international politics? And if that's kind of one way ahead in thinking about transitions?
Yeah, I just quickly, because there's a couple. Yes, the second, so the second, well, the last third of the book really is about the national context and how it relates to transnational developments in terms of the global coal market and the declining role of coal, and certainly it's the extent to which it's been redefined as a threat internationally, and how that then affects national level policy. So we tried to connect these local stories to that national context. I just wanted to quickly, so there's Marcus, Mirko, and something called Como. So we'll be looking for Mirko. Is Mirko still there?
I apologize to break in again. This is Sophia, one of the EXALT organizers. We have time during the session for one more question. Okay. But if you have questions that didn't get answered during the session, if you send them to the exalt@Helsinki Peace to Fee email, I promise you that I will make sure that they get over to James and company, and hopefully they will give us some answers, and we can make sure to post those along with the recording of the session on our website. So apologies that not all questions will be able to be addressed in the session, but I'm glad that everybody is so excited about the subject.
We'd love to do that, definitely. So, okay, I haven't heard back from Mirko. So maybe
okay,
Marcus.
Shall I try? I'm here. Yeah, it's working now, Eric. Or yeah.
Okay.
Sorry,
yeah.
Question more. On the approach and methodology. And sorry if you already touched upon it, but I was curious to hear more. So throughout the course of this research, which also took a few years and in different places, which I think is really important and interesting. So did you also, as researchers and people who have engaged with communities and then the movements, did you also somehow share the information about different struggles in different places? Because internationalist work is still surprisingly can be hard in anti-extractivist movements. So I was just wondering, did you find ways to share about different experiences from that perspective as well? Because also you spoke about how, because you also engage with local communities and movements, and also of course the international like Friends of the Earth. So because also they work in different ways. So I was just wondering, were you part of these exchanges also somehow, bringing in other cases and examples of the knowledge you've gathered elsewhere? Thanks.
Probably the media. What you talk about that. Look, I think there's two things we could say about that. I mean, we did workshops in all of the countries, and we tried to present what we learned from the case studies in the say in Germany and Australia when we were doing the workshop in India and vice versa, in fact visited some of the field sites. So I think there was an opportunity there for people at the field sites also to get a bit of a sense of this bigger picture and to hear a bit about the kinds of things that were happening in other countries. We were very happy to be interviewed by the local newspaper in Germany, and they were really thrilled about the fact, not just that we were interested in what had been happening there, but that this was part of a larger study looking at coal internationally. And I guess the other thing that, as James said, was that we tried to both treat the work of radio journalist, which is my background, as part of our research process. And in fact, Katja and I have written an article about you know, the sort of methodological challenges of a journalist and an ethnographer working together. But also that then was a way for us to try and communicate our findings to a wider audience. So as I said, James said, we made this 3-part radio series, documentary series for the Australian national broadcaster, and also documentary in German for the German national broadcaster. So we were trying then to also communicate the findings from all 3 countries to national and international audiences.
So thanks. I think we're out of time now, unfortunately.
Yeah, sure.
But I'd really like, so Marcus and whoever, Como, if they email us with the questions, we'll reply, and then this can be included in the PowerPoint, I guess. But thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
And buy the book. Or buy it for your library.
Use it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye.